Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre.
I basically always tell people that their lived experience or their daily lives and how they perceive things in their daily lives are highly valuable. And that none of the survey findings can ever negate what they feel is their reality. But what they have to remember is that is their reality, right? And that's where we once again come to, is the dress blue or is the dress tan, right? Our goal is to not capture each person's daily reality and to do each person's daily reality justice. Our goal is to capture the reality of Indian public opinion.
That was Neha Sehgal, Associate Director, Pew Research Centre. In this episode of BIC Talks, impact investor and co-founder of Bangalore Literature Festival, Sri Krishna Ramamurthy, engages Neha in a conversation about what went into this gargantuan undertaking. And now, over to Sri Krishna.
Hi, I'm Sri Krishna and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by the Bangalore International Centre. Our guest today is Neha Sehgal, Associate Director of Research at the Pew Research Centre, where she specializes in international polling on religion. Neha has authored many studies on religion and religious beliefs, including Christian-Muslim relations in sub-Saharan Africa, religion in Latin America, the religious beliefs and practices of Muslims around the world, and many others. Neha and her team are the force behind the Pew Research Centre's recent and very insightful report, Religion in India, Tolerance and Segregation, the centre's most comprehensive, in-depth exploration of Indian public opinion to date, with over 30,000 face-to-face interviews in 17 languages across the length and breadth of our country. The report concludes that Indian religious communities live together separately, and more specifically, Indians value religious tolerance, though they also live religiously segregated lives. Neha, welcome to BIC Talks. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Sri. Great to be here.
First up, congratulations to you and your team. I think that your report has led to you and the Pew Research Centre gaining household level popularity, at least in urban India. And it's quite likely that you have many more followers on Twitter from here now.
That's very kind. Thank you.
I thought it'd be good to focus our conversation on a few different things. The report has been out in public and has been discussed across print, TV, and online. And the headline findings have generated a fair bit of debate this past week. Given that, I thought it'd be great to focus on some of the lesser talked about questions, which I thought said a lot about our fascinating country and our people. And also a little bit about, how does this all really come through for you as a researcher, and how the report could shape some of our decisions and thought process. To start with, for many of us, the Pew Research Centre isn't as familiar a name. Could you tell us a little more about what you do and what some of the other work you've been doing in India and the region, Neha?
At the Pew Research Centre, we like to refer to ourselves as a fact tank. And we use this term to differentiate ourselves from the think tank world that's also very popular in Washington, D.C. and other capitals around the world. We consider ourselves a research organization. We generate reports based on empirical social science data using public opinion or demographic research or content analysis. And we talk about the trends shaping our world, but we don't take any policy positions and we do not make any normative statements. So you may notice in reading our report that we never say if tolerance is a good thing for India, if it's a bad thing for India, or segregation is a good or bad thing for India. That's because we have no position on any of these issues. We don't think it's our place to opine. We feel that we must capture public opinion and represent public opinion, but our own opinion is irrelevant. We have done work around the world on public opinion. This is not our first time in India. We have done public opinion work on political issues in India before. However, those sample sizes were much smaller. And that means that we cannot get as in-depth into the opinions of, for example, smaller religious communities or some of the regional differences that we see in India with a smaller sample size. This study is unique because with a 30,000 respondent sample size, that then allows us to get a lot more in depth into Indian public opinion than we have been able to do previously.
Got it. And sort of getting to the survey itself, I'm curious, and I'm sure most people are. What does all this really involve? What goes into surveying 30,000 people? What's the machinery like to pull off something like this? And sort of do tell us the story behind how all of this has happened in these past 2-3 years, and maybe even sort of one or two of your most memorable points or highlights from when you've been working on it in this time, Neha.
Thank you for asking that. So you want to know, kind of open the hood and let's see the engine. So we had this idea about 3 years ago that let's try and see what we can do in India. We worked in Western Europe, we worked in Israel, we worked in Central Europe, Latin America, but let's see, this issue of religion and identity is highly salient in India. What can we do there? Yeah, but at the same time, we were highly cognizant of the fact that religion is a thorny issue in India. It's a thorny issue everywhere, but it's especially salient in India in that way. And public opinion research in India is not easy. It's a large country, it's a diverse country, and sending interviewers to all these different parts of the country can be, logistically, it's kind of, you need a machinery to do it. So our first step was exploratory. And what we did was we did a whole bunch of qualitative work in India. We organized focus groups throughout the country, where we started bringing up these issues in focus groups. So we asked people to comment on true Indian identity and the connection of religion with true Indian identity. And we found that people wanted to share their opinion. They wanted to share it enthusiastically, and they were happy that somebody asked them. They weren't shy at all, about giving us.
What you're not saying is Indians love to talk.
Indians love to give their opinions. That's what we found. They love to talk about these issues. It's controversial, but they're not shy about it, and they will tell you. Right? You ask them, they will not hold back. Right? They'll tell you what they think. And one other thing we discovered was over and over again, Indians had a particular way of telling their story. They would talk about the history of their country. They would talk about the history of diversity in their country, and they would tell us over and over again how proud they are of the tolerance that their country shows. Right? And we felt that it's important to capture that story in the way that Indians want to tell us their story. So we took all that qualitative data and we devised a questionnaire that basically took what people had told us and made questions out of that. And then, when we went into the field, we first wanted to do a series of test interviews to test for cognition, if people were still freely talking about their opinion. Are the translations working? So we did several thousand test interviews. Normally, several thousand would be the total sample size, but for this study, that was just the beginning. And based on that, we refined our sampling strategy. We refined how respondents were being approached by interviewers, how they were being approached and how the interview was going, what kinds of questions were being asked. And then finally, at the end of 2019, we went into the field with the full 30,000 interview set. My favorite, there's several favorite memories. I was in Ludhiana and watching some of the test interviews and some of the training. I was going around with the interviewers, talking to these ladies, and we were doing the test interviews in the afternoon. So there was, these ladies were at home and they were talking about their opinion. And they asked me, one of the ladies, she was very boisterously sharing her opinion. And at the end of the interview, she asked me, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from Delhi," which is the truth. I was born in Delhi. And then she wanted to talk to me about the price of onions in Delhi. She asked me, "How much are onions in Delhi?" And I'm thinking, oh, she got me. I have no idea. I read the news about the price of onions in Delhi, but I can't remember. So, and then she went on, about her opinion, on the price of onions in Delhi. And I'm thinking, oh, wow, we just went from talking about her neighborhood and how she wants her children raised and who she wants them to marry to the price of onions. And she's just as enthusiastic about sharing her opinion.
Interesting. I guess as the results started to come together, perhaps what were some of your a priori hypotheses, and which of these were sort of in sync with what you were seeing, or perhaps not so much in sync with what you were finding? Or was it more like, you sort of went with where the data led you, Neha?
Yeah, I think it's more the latter. The difference between us and some of the more academic work is we're not theoretically based. We don't start with hypotheses and theories and hypotheses testing. We go where the data takes us. We devise a questionnaire based on what we think people care about. And then that's what then helps us get people engaged in the survey. But as the data started coming in, some of the attitudes on on Hindu identity, for example, were just phenomenally interesting. It's a very religious country, and so even though theologically, you know that in Hinduism, it's not really necessarily a theistic religion, right? But when you see that reflected in Hindu public opinion, where half of respondents are saying, a person who doesn't believe in God can still be a Hindu, it's still really striking in such a religious country.
I guess building on that, what were perhaps some of your aha moments as the data sort of started to all piece together, and you started to see more and more come through?
I think the regional difference in among Hindus is really fascinating. And this comes through in a variety of ways, but especially in questions about the relation between Hindu identity and Indian identity. So overall, we find that for a majority of Hindus, it is very important to be a Hindu, to be truly Indian. Nearly 2/3 of Hindus say that. But that share, exactly, but that you saw that in the data, but that share hides some of the diversity, even in Hindu public opinion. So when you go to the central parts of the country where the Hindi heartland is, which includes Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, there you see that number go up to 83%. But when you go to the south of the country, which includes Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Karnataka, you see that number come down to 42%. So that's a gulf, right, within the same religion in the same country.
Any further sense on what's driving some of those differences, or do you see some of the other questions that got asked sort of throw any light on what are the other factors driving that?
Closely related is kind of how people think about Hindu identity in the North versus the South. So, the question about eating beef, for example, can a person who eats beef still be a Hindu? In the North, you see people rejecting that idea, right? Somebody who eats beef cannot be a Hindu. That share is like in the 80s. But in the South, you come down to 50% of people saying, you can't be a Hindu if you eat beef. Can a person who doesn't believe in God still be a Hindu? In the North, it's divided. Some people saying sure, and some people saying no. Overall, the country is divided. But in the South, you get into 30% saying a person who doesn't believe in God can't be a Hindu, with the majority of people saying that an atheist can legitimately call himself or herself a Hindu. So it's a different concept of Hindu identity in the North versus the South, which seems to also lend itself to different understanding of sort of the political implications of Hindu identity and politics. Right? You see differences in how people in the North and the South vote, and that kind of speaks to the larger intertwining of religion, national identity, and language in India today.
Yeah, and we'll come to the whole national identity and what it means to be an Indian in just a bit, perhaps in one of my questions later in this conversation. But I still wanted to stay on the the religion and the geography, which are sort of the overarching focus segments for the survey, and really what stands out in the report and the findings itself. But if we were to look a little beyond that, what's your sense on some of the insights that you see the responses offering with respect to other segments, like say age or education levels, and if we were to education levels of the respondents, and if we were to slice and dice in with those two lenses, perhaps could you throw some light on what else have you found, or what else is it telling us?
Yeah, I think education is an important factor, and that's not unique to India. It's basically everywhere in our work. We find that people who are more educated tend to live less segregated lives. They tend to express more accepting views of others. That's true in India as well. Education is tied to lower levels of segregation. But I wouldn't say that in India that we see a huge difference between less educated and more well-educated people. The people who are better educated, they may live less religiously segregated lives, but it's not that they have gone the other way.
So it's not less important or otherwise then, perhaps.
Exactly. So it's not a different story. It's not that they're suddenly saying, no, my friend circle is diverse, or that I'm okay with interreligious marriage. It doesn't go that far. They're just less segregated than people who have lower levels of education. Age makes some difference, but again, it's the same thing. It doesn't change the story, though. People are still living religiously segregated lives, just less so when they're young.
Got it. And I think related to that, some of the questions and the responses that were, interesting for me in particular were, your some of the questions around, how often do you follow news? And clearly, I think the survey saying, the findings saying that 40% of India are daily news viewers, and while 15% is really not caring so much about the news, and while TV and print sort of seemed to be the majority. It sounded like news on coming through WhatsApp and internet, which comes with its own challenges. I would think, being a close third or a fourth. And going back to I guess to the question or the conversation you had with the lady in Ludhiana around onions. The other piece that was interesting for me was the question on the overall economic situation, of course, keeping in mind that this was pre-pandemic, but it was just really interesting that a large number described the economic situation as overall positive and really expecting it to change for the better. And it seems like, in general, people are overwhelmingly happy at some level. Thoughts on this or further insights that you found with perhaps some of the other questions related to economic situation?
Yeah, I mean, we typically begin with questions like that. We begin with, how often you're following the news, what do you think about your economic situation? We really use those as warm-up questions. They're easy for people to answer. It gets them in kind of the practice of, how to answer a survey and how the response options are, et cetera. And it, generally, we find people, like when you ask them about their economic situation, they tend to say, it's good. Right? We find that in poorer countries. We find that in richer countries as well. Because, you're just beginning a conversation with somebody. So that's why these are warm-up questions. Right? So just to get people kind of into the mode of talking about these things.
And staying on religion, I think that surprised me was we seem to know very little about other religions beyond our own. What do you read into that, or do you sense that was, with perhaps not too much that was asked about that to be able to get a better sense of things?
So the question basically was, how much would you say you know about Hindu religion and its practices, or Muslim religion and its practices? And it's a person's overall assessment. We didn't quiz them afterward on, on anything theological. So, and we've done this even in several other countries as well. But people, by their own admission, they said they don't know much about other religions. But it sort of makes sense, right? If you look at the kind of lives people are living, despite the fact that they think generally that diversity is a good thing for their country, they're living highly religiously segregated lives. So the level of contact with people of other religions is fairly minimal. So they're giving a pretty honest assessment, and it computes with the other aspects of their life.
And what does this report and I guess the survey, the questions and the report, what does it mean for public opinion? I did read your colleague Jonathan Evans saying, it's not uncommon to see seemingly contradictory viewpoints in public opinion. And I think the two or three things that sort of stood out for me there were the report stating that religious conversion is rare in India, and personal discrimination because of religion or because of caste doesn't seem to be very high, which is really not what popular perception is in India today. How do you dissect that?
Yeah, I mean, and on the question of religious conversion, I know that this is a topic that's bandied about, a fair amount in the Indian media. So we thought, why don't we use the sociological tools we've used elsewhere in the world to measure, what level of religious conversion is taking place? And we've done this in several other countries. We've done it in the US extensively. We have documented trends there. We've done it in Western Europe. So that way, we'd be able to inject some data into the public debate. So, the results are in front of you, and it's up to you, how you want to judge those results. You might say that the 0.4% of former Hindus who are now Christians is a lot for India. Or you might say that's not a lot for India. It really depends on your perception. I can talk in relative terms because we've done this around the world. Religious conversion in India, compared to what we've seen elsewhere in other countries, is rare. And the share of Hindus who are now Christians is just a sliver of the population. But again, it's a matter of perception, right? So there's a post that went viral on social media a few years ago. It's a picture of a dress, and some people looked at it and they said it's a blue dress, and some people looked at it and they said it's a brown dress, and both were completely convinced of, of their opinion. You can look at the same data and come to different conclusions. This is ours based on research on this around the world.
And on the sort of, people not seeming like having faced personal discrimination in recent times because of caste or religion, I guess the other aspect to that is, do you sense perhaps there might have also been a level of hesitancy in responding to something like this, and that could that also be something that contributes to this response? And again, I'm only asking this from just trying to probe a little more, only because what one reads about is the contrary.
Certainly, and it's a fair question. Yes, I mean, we do find that for the vast majority of people, they don't think that there is widespread caste discrimination in India, and they don't think that there is widespread religious discrimination in India. And it's certainly fair for someone to say, well, what I read about in India is all about caste discrimination and religious discrimination. So how can it be? It's two ways of looking at the same thing. Certainly, if you were to start coding instances of social hostilities involving religion in India, you might come to a different conclusion. What we have measured is a public perception. Now, your question is, could the public perception be biased? Could there be a hesitancy to admit that there is widespread discrimination in India? That certainly could be. It's what we call social desirability effect in surveys, right? Where people are wanting to give a response that they think is either in line with the ruling government and or in line with how they want to project themselves. That could certainly be. If that is the case, we don't see a consistent pattern of that happening. Take, for example, Muslim public opinion, where you could say that, given the persecution of Muslims in India, perhaps they didn't want to give their honest opinion, right? That's one plausible hypothesis. Okay, so let's break that down a little bit. We do find that Muslims in India expressed enthusiastic support for separate religious courts. And we also know that that is against the stance of the ruling party. And it goes against the stance of every other religious group in India. But yet, Muslim public opinion expressed enthusiastic support for this particular policy. They were not concerned, right, that they're going against the stance of the BJP. So that tells us that Muslim public opinion in India is more complex than just saying that they will say, they will not give their true opinion, or that they're too scared about giving their true opinion. When it comes to the issue of discrimination, Muslim attitudes on discrimination seem to match the attitudes of other religious groups. Right? About the same share of Muslims as some other religious groups said that there is that they face religious discrimination in India, or that there is widespread discrimination in India. So once again, if there was some kind of self-censoring by Muslims, then it's just a coincidence that their opinion then matches, right, that of other religious groups. That just seems like too big a coincidence, right? And look at the regional variation in Muslim attitudes. In the north of the country, 40% of Muslims say that they have faced religious discrimination in the past 12 months. So again, we come back again and again to Muslim public opinion in India being more complex than just the simple statement of they're too scared to give their opinion. That just seems too simplistic.
True. Yeah, and I guess then in that case, perhaps similar also when with the caste lens too, I would think. Or would you not agree there? Again, just what's the data telling you?
For sure. Let's take a look at the caste lens. I think with the caste lens, the interesting thing is that people said that widespread caste discrimination is not too much an issue in India. Right? Some did say that it is an issue. Right? Roughly 1 in 5 did say that. But to the majority of people, they said that there's no widespread caste discrimination in India. At the same time, they told us all their friends belong to their caste, or most of their friends belong to their caste. Stopping inter-caste marriage is very important. And some people also said they don't want a neighbor who belongs to scheduled caste. So how in people's mind, are they saying that caste discrimination is not widespread in India? And then they're going on to say that they don't want intercaste marriage, or they think actually it's very important to stop intercaste marriage, or that they don't want a neighbor who's scheduled caste. Isn't this a contradiction? Well, clearly to them, it's not. Clearly to them, caste segregation is not the same thing as caste discrimination, right? So it really gives you kind of an insight into what a society sees as discrimination depends on what they see as fair, right? And it gives you an insight into Indian perceptions of whether caste segregation is acceptable in their society or not. And I think one additional element to this is what we see in the South, right? Now in the South, you have 30% saying that there is widespread caste discrimination in India, and that's higher than other regions. How is that, right? Because in the South, you have anti-caste movements, you have the flattening of caste hierarchies. Dalits in the South have done better economically than Dalits elsewhere. Could it be that in the South, the perception of what is fair has changed? Or could it be that people in the South are saying, well, maybe things are okay here, but in the rest of the country, right, there's still widespread discrimination. But could it be that their perception, right, of caste segregation or what is acceptable is now different because of the history of these anti-caste movements?
And as you sort of started to see the results emerge on at least on these two sort of topics, right, around discrimination with religion and caste, did it feel like there would have to be, there could have perhaps been other questions that got asked in order to peel this some more and get to maybe calling out something that's a little more definitive? Because I mean, again, because it's contradictory for the layperson that's reading this, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that I think so. I mean, I think there's we learn a lot about how we could probe more in this area, perhaps in the future. And there was an editorial by Mukul Kesavan in Telegraph, I believe, that made some excellent suggestions in this regard about, we could ask about, have you ever faced a problem finding housing or finding a job, etc. We have asked questions in along those lines previously. We did ask them, for example, in Israel. We asked Jewish Americans along, questions along those lines. So, we could certainly think about doing something like that in the future. I think part of what we have to keep in mind from the perspective of a survey researcher is that we don't know these things in advance. Right? So, so when we're designing the questionnaire, like we take the questionnaire is designed, it's tested, we have it reviewed by a panel of expert advisors who have knowledge of the region. And at that point, we feel, okay, the questions are working, we have something, let's go ahead and try this out. And then inevitably the data comes back from the field and we say, oh, we should have gone more here or more there. And it's nearly impossible, to predict that a priori. So just to keep that in mind, and that maybe perhaps that's just the limitation of survey research or any research in general, that it's nobody has quite that crystal ball when you're designing the question. But research improves upon research. And my hope is that Indian survey organizations like CSDS or others can improve or build upon our work in the future.
I know you talked about some of the work you've done in Israel. You also alluded to differences and how some of these things have played out in sub-Saharan Africa. In what respects is the India survey, similar to surveys elsewhere? Where does it differ? Is there a sort of commonality of issues that you deal with? What drives some of the thinking there, Neha?
Yeah, so normally we'll do multi-country surveys. We'll cover an entire region. For example, Latin America will include 19 countries, or Western Europe will be 16 countries. 2 times my team has focused on single countries. One was Israel, one is India. Both times we focused on these countries because of their uniqueness. Israel is one of 2 countries in the world that has one of the largest Jewish populations. India is home to the vast majority of the world's Hindus. So because of that uniqueness, as well as the diversity of India, we felt we wouldn't be able to do justice to India by doing a regional study. Plus, India doesn't have that much in common with a lot of its neighbors. So let's just do work in India. Now, the in-depth studies do give us that detailed picture, right, of what's going on with religion and identity. And if I have to compare these 2 studies, Israel and India, you find a similar level of religious segregation in both countries. And Israelis also live religiously segregated lives. Indians live religiously segregated lives. But one point of difference between Israel and India is the secularization of Israel. There's a large component among the Jewish community in Israel that calls itself a secular Jewish. The background is secular Jewish. And the opinions of this group are dramatically different from the opinions of the Orthodox Jewish groups in Israel, such that they are gulfs. India, we see a similar gulf between the North and the South as far as some of the political opinions are concerned, the importance of beef to Hindu identity, the importance of religion to national identity, how people vote. But we also find that people are religious. They're religious in the North, they're religious in the South. There's some signs of people in the South being somewhat less religious than people in the North. So you do see some secularization in the South, but the South is still quite religious. So what you're not seeing in India, in direct contrast to Israel, is a large and strong secular segment of society that is significant in numbers and therefore expresses lower levels of commitment on religion, more liberal social attitudes on a variety of issues, and stands in direct contrast with a more religious segment.
From your experience, have you seen these reports sort of get effectively used as sort of baseline and tracking studies, or how do these drive policy or inputs into that at a broader level, Neha?
I mean, our goal is to inform public opinion. I mean, our goal is to empower people with data, and so that when they talk about these issues from different perspectives, they can be grounded in the same set of facts. Which comes to the end of our mission. Now, policymakers may use the data in a similar fashion. They may think through how to think about some of these thorny issues in India from the perspective of data, all well and good, also within our mission. But it is definitely not part of our mission to advise in that area. We feel that you cannot be actively trying to change something and actively trying to study it at the same time. Somewhere or the other, your desire to change things will bias the way you think about the subject. So there's kind of a line that we won't cross. Right? So I will never make any policy recommendation to you or to anybody. Right? That is up to people who know the country better, and never claim to be an India expert either. Actually, my expertise in India is basically based on the data, and now it's up to the Indian public where they take this in their household dinner table conversations or in the parliament.
But I think as you start making more webinar appearances, your India policy and your India expert view will change, I think.
People can thank you. People are free to express whatever opinion they want, right? I'm a public opinion researcher, so for me that's a great, that's great. People can express whatever they want, but I, personally, I would never not categorize myself in that box.
Sure. And just going back to where I started around, just the overall what went into sort of pulling this off and how this all came through. One notices that if an individual's lived experience or the perceptions that I have don't match with survey findings, then there is a tendency to reject it, perhaps even question the methodologies. How do you normally address something like this?
I basically always tell people that their lived experience or their daily lives and how they perceive things in their daily lives are highly valuable. And that none of the survey findings can ever negate what they feel is their reality. But what they have to remember is that is their reality, right? And that's where we once again come to, is the dress blue or is the dress tan, right? Our goal is to not capture each person's daily reality and to do each person's daily reality justice. Our goal is to capture the reality of Indian public opinion, right? There's a different place, right, for people to express their own perspective and how they experience their own lives. And that is a highly valuable part of the conversation.
Do you see these sort of responses come through in fairly sort of standardized ways across the world? I mean, the tendency to accept or reject the things that you're putting out in reports?
Oh, certainly. That's a very human tendency, and it's common around the world. The good thing is that in my job, I'm not trying to sell you anything. So we're not commercial. So we're not monetizing the clicks, and and there comes a point where if you don't think that what we're offering you is useful, right, at any level, either personally or for policymaking or for your national conversation as a society, then there comes a point where I say, that's fine. That's up to your judgment. And that's why we're 100% foundation funded. And there comes a point where I'm not going to try to convince you. All I'm going to do is clarify the methodology, explain the science behind us doing what we do, and then there comes a point where it's really up to you.
I'll maybe end with a bigger picture question. I think for me, one of the key questions that the survey asked was, what does it mean to be truly Indian? And irrespective of religion, and from what you see in the findings across all of the 29,999, that one elusive Indian that didn't make it to the survey. But what are the 3 or 4 things that you would think define an Indian identity, Neha, from all that you've seen from the responses?
Questions we asked about true Indian identity are inspired by the work of Brubaker et al., who have come up with a way of understanding identity that includes both civic elements as well as nationalist elements. So and a good example of the civic element might be, do you think respecting the country's institutions and laws is important? What about respecting the army? What about paying taxes and so on, right? And then there is the more nationalist element of identity, which is religion, or in some cases, in a multilingual country like India, language or ancestry. In India today, we find that for the vast majority of people, the civic elements of national identity do carry considerable import. People attach the importance of these civic values closely to their national identity. They tell us respecting Indian institutions and laws is very important. Supporting the cricket team is quite important. But at the same time, you do find that significant share of the Indian public, ancestry, religion, and language are also quite important. And particularly for the country's Hindus, these things are all 3 stand out as important. So once again, India is a complex country. Every country considers itself complex, and in India, the paradoxes are nearly always in front of you. And both things have import. Both things are happening at the same time.
Indeed. So what's next for Pew with an India focus, and any other elements from the report that you're going to be bringing out to sort of share more insights, Neha?
Yeah, we will have a series of reports on India. India is a big focus for us this year. This was actually the first of several others that are going to be coming out. I'll just give you like a little teaser of what's coming. We will be looking at gender more closely, because this particular interview did include a lot of questions about gender, so watch out for that. We will also be doing some analysis of trend data based on census. So there'll be some more along demographic analysis lines. And then for us, once we can get through this series of reports, I think we might take a break for a little while. The world is a large and complex place, and we might continue our foray into Asia with a lot to be done in Southeast Asia, a lot to be done in East Asia. But I do hope to be back sooner rather than later.
Yeah, no, we hope so too. Congrats once again on putting all this together and bringing this out, and hats off to to you and the team for the fantastic work that's gone into doing this. And thank you very much for being with us on BIC Talks.
Thank you, Sri. Much appreciated.
Thank you for hanging in there and listening to the full conversation. If you liked what you heard, do share it with friends and family. You can also leave us a review or rating on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. The crew behind this podcast is Gaurav Krishna on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Saranaraj and Raghu Tankaila. Episode artwork and design is by Chandni Venkataraman. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcenter.org. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.